Linda Mason had always preferred structure over spectacle. Precision was her quiet rebellion against the chaos she saw in the world, especially in her field. As the regional director for one of the largest property management companies on the East Coast, she had seen every kind of tenant dispute, structural disaster, and local drama imaginable. But what always struck her the most wasn't the dramatic, the burst pipes, the police tape, the media attention. No, it was the slow, grinding rot of systems that failed from the inside out. Over the years, Linda had learned that when a residential building begins to falter, it rarely starts with bricks or beams. It begins with people, small tyrants in garden gloves, rigid ideologues with too much time and too little oversight, people who learned they could manipulate rules not to preserve harmony, but to dominate others. And so when anonymous complaints began to trickle into her office about a particular mid-rise complex in Westwood, complaints that were emotional, persistent, and oddly uniform, she didn't respond with clipboard inspections or an email blast. She packed a suitcase, signed a temporary lease under a subsidiary managed name, and moved in for 30 days. It was unorthodox, yes, technically unnecessary. But Linda had learned long ago that the only way to understand dysfunction was to breathe its air, hear its silences, and walk its tension. Paper trails were tidy, but people were not. And nothing revealed the truth like presence. So she took the elevator to the 4th floor of a building her company had owned for years, but only recently absorbed into her portfolio, to unlock the door to Unit 412, and quietly entered what would be her home for the next month. No fanfare, no assistant, just her, a duffel bag, and a notepad full of names she intended to observe, not confront. It wasn't espionage, it was immersion. She wasn't here to expose anyone. She was here to measure the pulse of a place that had stopped trusting its own heartbeat. The first few days were uneventful, almost deceptively so. The lobby was clean, the maintenance man polite, the noise levels reasonable. If anything, it felt sterile, too quiet for a building with over 90 residents. Neighbors passed each other with practiced nods, but no warmth, no chatter, no casual hellos. It was like walking through a place where everyone had learned to fear visibility. No one greeted her, though she made the effort. No one corrected her when she mistook the mailroom for a utility closet, or when she used the service elevator by accident. It wasn't hostility, it was a cold indifference, as if friendliness had been outlawed. Then came the knock. It was exactly 7:03 a.m. on a Thursday when Linda opened her door to find a woman she had only glimpsed from a distance but already suspected was central to the building's ecosystem of control. The woman was in her late 50s, with iron slacks, a pristine blouse that screamed self-importance, and an expression that suggested the air itself should ask her permission before being inhaled. She held a clipboard. Of course she did. Her name, as she introduced herself, was Karen. Just Karen. Not hi, I'm Karen from 402, or I'm on the building committee, just Karen, as if her name was enough. And maybe in this place it was. Karen wasted no time with pleasantries. There are expectations here, she said, as though reading from a script. People who live here understand that we maintain standards. We respect each other's routines. We don't leave umbrellas to dry in the hallway. We don't open windows after 10 p.m. It's about collective consideration. Linda, in her usual calm, measured tone, smiled and said she'd make sure to keep that in mind. She offered a handshake. Karen looked at it like it was a wet tissue, then ignored it. Instead, she handed Linda a single-page document labeled, in Comic Sans font and bold underline, Neighborly Standards Revised 2021, unofficial, but strongly suggested. It included guidelines such as limit laundry machine use after 8 p.m., no slippers in common areas, and all mail must be retrieved within 2 hours of delivery to prevent buildup. At the bottom there was a line for a signature. Karen tapped it twice with her pen. Linda didn't sign. She read it, nodded politely, and said, I appreciate you letting me know. That was it. No confrontation. No dismissal. Just acknowledgement. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, not in offense, but in calculation. She had expected either submission or resistance. The indifference was more dangerous. Over the next few days, the subtle mechanisms of social enforcement began to stir. Linda returned from work to find passive-aggressive notes on her door. Laundry scent a bit strong today, maybe try a fragrance-free detergent? Or your shoes seemed loud in the hallway last night, thicker soles perhaps? None were signed. Each was typed. The next week, a neighbor quietly moved his bike further from her door, although it had been leaning harmlessly beside hers for days. Conversations in the elevator stopped when she entered. There was an ecosystem here, and she had disrupted it simply by not playing along. Linda noted everything, but not with paranoia, with clarity. This wasn't unusual. She had seen buildings rot from the same behavior. People like Karen didn't need official power when they could rely on an invisible network of silence, fear, and manipulated etiquette. Still, Linda never broke stride. She made coffee each morning, read reports in her modest kitchen, and exchanged occasional glances with the one or two residents who still had flickers of rebellion left in their eyes. There was one young couple who always seemed nervous, one older man who watched too much TV and didn't seem to care, and one woman with sharp eyes who said nothing but nodded once at Linda in the laundry room. It wasn't friendship, but it was something real. Linda could work with that. It was a Tuesday morning, brisk and cloudless, when the escalation occurred. Linda had just returned from a short jog and was sipping coffee on the bench near the mailroom when Karen appeared. She walked straight over, holding another paper in her hand, this one with highlighted sections. "We need to talk about your recycling habits," she said without greeting. "You've been putting soft plastics in the wrong bin. I've seen it twice now." Linda, surprised, replied gently that she'd double-checked the labels, though she was fairly sure she'd followed them correctly. Karen's face tightened. "I'm not accusing. I'm informing. It's people like you who create disorder, people who think the rules are optional." Linda didn't flinch. She simply stood up, took a last sip of her coffee, and said, "Then perhaps the rules should be clearer." And that's when it happened fast, without warning. Karen's hand shot forward, and her coffee, still steaming, splashed directly across Linda's blouse and neck. Not a drop by accident, a full, deliberate throw. There was a moment of stunned silence, not just from Linda but from the building itself. A nearby tenant gasped but did nothing. Linda stood motionless, the coffee dripping from her collarbone, her expression unreadable. She looked directly into Karen's eyes, not with rage, but with a look Karen had clearly not encountered before, a look of composed authority. Then Linda did what Karen least expected. She said nothing. No shouting, no threats. She calmly walked back to her apartment, shut the door behind her, and picked up her phone. Within the hour, she had requested a full internal review of the property's community conduct issues and requested background audits of all third-party service contractors associated with the building. Nothing aggressive, nothing illegal, just corporate protocol. Linda wasn't there to fight. She was there to clean house. And as far as she was concerned, Karen had just handed her the mop. The building didn't speak about the coffee incident, not directly. There were no emails, no apologies whispered in the hallway. But something shifted in the atmosphere, subtle yet unmistakable. The air seemed more strained, the glances sharper, and the silences heavier. A few residents avoided Linda entirely, turning corners prematurely or ducking into doorways with the same awkwardness one might use to avoid a power outage or a stranger's grief. Others watched her now, cautiously, as though waiting to see whether she would erupt or retreat. Karen, for her part, behaved as if nothing had happened. She continued her morning patrols with her clipboard, her notes, her hollow smile. But beneath that carefully rehearsed exterior, there was a hint of tension, a micro flicker behind her eyes every time she passed Linda. Perhaps she sensed it, the inevitability that the silence wouldn't last. Linda didn't need to retaliate emotionally. She had already made her move, and it was deeper, colder, and more effective than anything Karen could anticipate. The request for the internal audit had been discreetly formalized within hours of the incident. Not an investigation into Karen per se, but an evaluation of community oversight standards, complaints history, and contractor behavior patterns. It was not about vengeance. It was about exposure. When systems rot, one doesn't simply cut away the mold, they inspect the conditions that allowed it to grow in the first place. Linda knew that people like Karen rarely acted alone. They depended on inertia, on passive compliance and quiet allies in maintenance departments or billing offices. What Linda needed wasn't punishment. It was sunlight. Still, there were rules to follow, and one of them was neutrality. Until the results of the audit came back, Linda continued her routine. She went to work each day as usual, maintained polite interactions with the staff, and ensured her behavior remained beyond reproach. But it didn't take long for pressure to mount. Karen, having interpreted Linda's silence as either fear or shame, regained her bravado. It started with low-level disruptions. A plumbing repair was suddenly scheduled for Linda's unit without notice, requiring access and forcing her to take off work. Her key card inexplicably stopped working at the gym entrance, and she was told to check with building security, despite there being no official security staff. Flyers began appearing on the community bulletin board, unsigned but unmistakably Karen's voice, increased reports of disrespectful behavior from certain residents, and it's time we demand accountability and community compliance. Then came the false complaints. At first, Linda noticed nothing unusual. A minor note about loud music, though she never played any. A warning letter about misuse of the shared laundry machine, claiming she had left detergent spills behind. But by the third incident, she realized the pattern. Each warning had no date or time, no eyewitness. He just typed formalities with a passive-aggressive edge, citing multiple residents as sources and threatening escalating fines. Linda didn't react publicly. She logged everything. Each letter, each miscommunication. She recorded details, times, context, any witnesses she could discreetly identify. And still, she kept her posture level, her tone even. There was no battle to fight, only information to gather. What concerned her more than the notes was the response or lack thereof from the building staff. When she raised a query about the incorrect keycard deactivation, the front office offered a lukewarm apology, insisting it was a system error. When she asked about the plumbing order, she was told the maintenance crew must have confused her unit number. But Linda had worked too many years in logistics not to recognize a pattern. These weren't coincidences. They were coordinated stressors meant to push her to react, to provoke an emotional outburst that could be used to discredit her. And still, Linda did not waver. Instead, she took a step further. She requested all building records pertaining to internal complaints and resident violations for the past 6 months, not as a resident, but through her company's legal compliance division. This request was not optional. When it landed on the property manager's desk, the reaction was swift and quiet. The tone of correspondence shifted from casual deflection to guarded professionalism. Suddenly, there were no more unsigned warnings, no more mysterious maintenance disruptions. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, instructing the entire building to fall in line. But Karen didn't fall in line. Not right away. 2 days later, Linda returned from work to find a small envelope taped to her door. Inside was a folded note, not typed, but handwritten in aggressive cursive, "You don't belong here. We will make sure of that." No name, no signature, just that. For the first time since her arrival, Linda paused. Not because of the note's message, it was childish in its execution, but because of what it represented. This was no longer passive resistance. This was a threat. Linda scanned the hallway, noted the placement of nearby security cameras, one facing the elevator, another angled poorly toward the stairwell. Neither would have caught the hand that taped the letter to her door. She took a photo of it, placed the original into an evidence sleeve from her personal folder, and made no further comment. That evening, she called a meeting not with Karen, not with building management, but with her team back at corporate headquarters. There would be no confrontation. There would be documentation, escalation, and accountability. Within 72 hours, a new team arrived on site. Not investigators in suits, not enforcers, but a quiet triad of internal compliance officers posing as consultants. Their job was simple: observe, assess, and report. They would blend into the community events, request maintenance work as residents, and quietly interview other tenants under the pretense of tenant satisfaction surveys. Linda stayed entirely out of their work. She didn't speak to them, didn't reference their presence, didn't even acknowledge the arrival of unfamiliar faces in the lobby. But she noticed the ripple effect. Some residents began to talk more openly in common areas, no longer hushed when they passed Karen. Others started mentioning oddities to the front desk: sudden fee increases, confusing repair charges, rules that seemed to change weekly. And Karen? Karen grew quieter. Not at first, but gradually. Her daily announcements faded. Her laminated notes on community boards disappeared. Her patrols stopped. Something was changing, and she could feel it slipping from her fingers. Then came the most telling moment. Linda received a call from her assistant not related to the building but to an adjacent property in another district. Word had traveled. A longtime regional supervisor in that building had mentioned offhand that a resident at Westwood had reached out, concerned that their community standards were being threatened by internal disruption. When asked for clarification, the resident Karen had identified Linda by her real name, citing unusual behavior and inappropriate interest in building operations. In short, Karen had attempted to report Linda, not knowing, of course, who Linda was. It was bold. It was desperate. It was the final mistake. Linda thanked her assistant, made a single note in her journal, and prepared for what would come next: not vengeance, not confrontation, but formal reckoning. The kind that doesn't knock loudly but locks doors quietly. Because Karen had demanded that Linda follow her rules. Now Linda would show her what real rules looked like. There was something disturbingly quiet about the way things began to accelerate. Not the kind of escalation marked by shouts or police sirens, but the insidious kind that wore a polite smile and carried a clipboard. The building remained composed. On the surface, lobbies were mopped, hallways vacuumed, flower beds refreshed, but beneath that was a growing current of tension, rippling through every interaction. The compliant smiles of the staff became tighter, less genuine. The occasional pleasantry from a neighbor now arrived with a lingering glance, as if they were waiting for Linda to say something first, to misstep, to confirm whatever whisper campaign had begun circulating about her behind closed doors. The atmosphere had turned brittle, and it was Karen who had struck the match. What Karen lacked in official authority, she more than made up for with social capital, the kind rooted in passive-aggressive alliances, long-term gossip campaigns, and the manipulation of systems that were designed for cooperation, not defense. She began reasserting herself with fervor. Though her public routine had softened after Linda's corporate audit team began discreetly embedding in the community, she did not retreat. Instead, she redirected her energy into a campaign that was more covert, more carefully orchestrated. The first maneuver came in the form of a petition, innocent on its surface, cloaked in language, about reinstating traditional community oversight and restoring neighbor-led initiatives. It was written to sound harmless, even nostalgic. But the implications were sharp. Karen was positioning herself as the savior of the old order, the protector of the status quo, and Linda was now its visible disruption. The petition was passed door to door, slipped under doors late at night, and circulated during small, whispered gatherings in common spaces. Some signed out of fear, some out of habit, and a few perhaps out of genuine belief that Karen, with her boundless certainty and fierce organization, was the only thing standing between them and chaos. Linda watched this unfold with professional detachment, never intervening, never confronting. She understood something Karen didn't, That real leadership wasn't about controlling people, it was about showing them who had been controlling them all along. Still, there was a cost to silence. The building's management, either complicit or cowed, began reinstating old protocols Karen had pushed for randomized inspections, curfews on certain amenities, even a monthly community behavior summary, which, while lacking official backing, was tacked to the bulletin board like scripture. Then came the harassment, but it was cleverly disguised, wrapped in procedure and paperwork. Linda began receiving formal notices regarding her lease, all framed as standard enforcement. One claimed her guest list exceeded policy limits, though she had hosted no one. Another alleged damage to shared property, a hallway plant disturbed beyond recognition with no photos, no witnesses, just an invoice for a replacement. Maintenance requests she filed were mysteriously delayed or lost in processing. And when she called the front desk, the responses became clipped, passive, and strangely rehearsed. The on-site property manager, a thin, balding man named Doyle, had suddenly grown a spine where previously he'd shown only mild disinterest. He spoke to Linda in tones that mimicked authority, referencing policy codes incorrectly and citing complaints with a confidence that was almost certainly borrowed from Karen's vocabulary. He wouldn't look her in the eyes. Linda, still maintaining her undercover presence, escalated internally. She documented everything, compiled logs of communication failures, and forwarded each new incident to the compliance team with surgical precision. She didn't need to confront Doyle, she needed him to keep digging his own grave. What she did do, however, was shift her approach. No longer simply observing, she began talking to residents, carefully, strategically. She chose her moments, in elevators, near the laundry room, while checking mail. Casual remarks, open-ended questions. "I've noticed a lot of changes here. Has it always been like this?" The responses varied. Some shrugged it off with tired resignation. Others offered half smiles and silence. But a few, the ones with tension behind their eyes, began to talk. Quietly, cautiously, as if confessing to a stranger in a church pew. One woman, older, with arthritic fingers and a nervous laugh, confessed that she signed the petition because Karen had told her Linda was trying to remove senior housing rights. Wait. Another admitted Karen had warned him that speaking to Linda might result in a rent hike due to surveillance protocols. Lies, all of them. Strategic, malicious lies. The compliance officers noticed it too. In their weekly debrief with Linda, conducted entirely off-premises at a local business suite, they confirmed what she had suspected, a coordinated effort to distort her presence, that mobilize fear and manipulate perception among residents. But what made it worse was that Karen had also begun targeting the staff. Janitorial services were redirected without oversight. Security protocols were altered for temporary reasons with no explanation. Contractors complained offhandedly that someone was micromanaging their work orders. One referred to it as a two-headed beast, building management on paper, but Karen in practice. It wasn't just social dominance now. It was operational infiltration. And yet, in the midst of this rising tide, Linda remained composed. This wasn't her first systemic failure. She had dealt with toxic boards, hostile takeovers, and property fraud. What made this different was the audacity of its simplicity. Karen had built an empire out of tone, suggestion, and repetition. She didn't need authority. She only needed everyone else to believe she had it. But Karen wasn't infallible. Her next move was a mistake, a small one, almost forgettable, but it created the first real crack in her carefully constructed mask. She accused a young resident, a quiet man who worked night shifts and barely interacted with anyone, of disrupting the community sleep schedule by walking too heavily in the hallway at midnight. It was petty. It was absurd. But it was also documented, filed formally, and Doyle had the audacity to hand-deliver the notice with a warning. The man, shaken and embarrassed, reached out to Linda, not knowing who she truly was, but sensing in her someone who didn't fold. And Linda, rather than dismissing it, took his case personally. not as an act of vengeance against Karen, but as a moment of precise justice. Within 48 hours, that incident was folded into the compliance team's broader report. They cross-referenced it with other complaints, analyzed the language patterns, and compared timestamps. The result? A clear pattern of falsified complaints originating from the same internal extension, Doyle's. Whether he was acting under Karen's direct pressure or out of sheer incompetence was irrelevant. The documentation proved abuse of internal systems, and that was actionable. Linda didn't announce the findings. She didn't send a memo or schedule a meeting. She simply passed the report up the chain. Legal reviewed it. HR reviewed it. Risk management reviewed it. And then, in a simple administrative move, the property management team on site was temporarily suspended pending investigation. Doyle was escorted out one morning under the guise of a staff restructuring meeting. Residents noticed. Whispers began to shift tone. Fear loosened its grip. Karen, of course, tried to spin it. At the next resident meeting, one that Linda attended quietly in the back, Karen claimed Doyle had been pressured out by external forces, that changes were being imposed by those who don't understand community culture. But her voice cracked mid-sentence. Her eyes flicked to Linda, who stared back with calm neutrality. Karen had overplayed her hand. The leash she had wrapped around the building was beginning to fray, strand by strand. And Linda? She didn't need to raise her voice. The system was working now. The wheel had turned. And for the first time since she arrived, it wasn't Karen steering it. The silence after Doyle's removal was not celebratory. It wasn't even relief. It was something heavier, stiff, uncertain, like a room with all the windows suddenly closed. People began to notice things shifting, but no one knew yet whether it was a cleansing or a quieting before the next storm. The building's routines were interrupted, maintenance calls took longer. The front desk was manned by a rotating series of temporary employees who smiled politely but had no knowledge of previous requests. The familiar discomfort remained, but now it had no name, no face. And that, for some, was even worse. Karen vanished for 2 days. No morning check-ins. No patrols. No laminated announcements on the community board. It was as if the queen of the hive had retreated to her chamber, waiting out a purge she hadn't predicted. When she did reemerge, it was not with surrender but reinvention. She returned not in power but in persona, suddenly softer, conversational, with pastel tones and well-timed smiles. She began knocking on doors, not to issue rules but to check in. She brought banana bread to a young mother in 407. She offered to help an elderly tenant with her groceries. She lingered in the courtyard like she was part of the scenery, not the architect of it. Linda, watching from her 4th-floor window, understood exactly what was happening. Karen was performing damage control. She had realized that the ground beneath her had shifted, and now she was racing to recast herself not as a tyrant, but as a misunderstood matriarch. But Karen was too late. The compliance report, now officially logged and expanding daily, had begun collecting statements from staff, residents, even vendors. A plumber revealed he had received repeated complaints about unverified job requests routed through a personal email address linked to Karen. A dog walker who worked weekends admitted that Karen had warned her not to speak to certain residents too much or risk losing her building access. And the young man from the earlier harassment claim, the one accused of walking too loudly, came forward again. This time with a printed screenshot from a tenant message board where Karen, under an anonymous account, had posted disparaging comments about lazy, disrespectful types who don't belong in this kind of place. The language was familiar, too familiar. The company's legal team began quietly preparing for what might become a formal cease and desist order if further harassment could be tied to her directly. Linda, throughout this, remained the same, composed, methodical, quiet. She didn't need to raise her voice or position herself as a savior. Her job was to guide the process, not to become the story. Still, she knew the moment was approaching when discretion would no longer be enough. The audit had uncovered deep fractures in the building's operating culture, violations of trust, systemic misuse of authority, and a chilling pattern of manipulation that had persisted for over 2 years. And in the center of that slow decay was a woman who had learned how to wear power like perfume, subtle, intoxicating, and utterly invasive. The internal findings demanded response, not retribution, not even public reprimand, but action. The company scheduled a mandatory community meeting, something rare, something serious. Residents were notified that an executive representative would be addressing them regarding the future of the building's operations and resident oversight. The announcement alone sent a shiver through the halls. It was formal. It was unavoidable. It was a crack in the artificial sense of stability that Karen had manufactured for so long. The evening of the meeting, the rec room was full. Folding chairs were arranged in rows, and people filed in quietly, glancing at each other with the nervous energy of a courtroom audience. Linda arrived last. Not as a guest, not as a resident, but as who she was. When she walked to the front of the room and turned to face them, a wave of recognition passed through the group. For some, it was a simple acknowledgement. For others, a moment of stunned realization. Karen, seated in the second row with her legs crossed and hands folded, went pale. Linda introduced herself formally, stated her position, and outlined the purpose of the audit. She didn't mention names, she didn't need to. She spoke of transparency, of restored channels of trust, of rebuilding community with structure instead of fear. And then she did something unexpected, something devastating in its simplicity. She opened the floor to the residents. Not a survey, not a form. A real, live opportunity to speak. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then an older man near the back raised his hand and asked if complaint procedures would be reviewed. A woman followed, expressing confusion over last month's maintenance fees. Then another hand and another. Suddenly the room wasn't still, it was moving, breathing, voices overlapping and stories colliding. Not chaos, liberation. And in the midst of it all, Karen sat frozen, lips pursed, gaze fixed. Her control had always relied on silence, and silence had just been shattered. But it was one voice that struck hardest. A middle-aged woman, tall, neatly dressed, stood up and turned not to Linda, but to Karen. Her voice didn't shake. "You told me not to let my son play outside after 7, she said, because it bothered certain people. I believed you. I told him to stop, and he cried. Every night." The room hushed. The woman didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply sat back down. And Karen, for the first time, looked away. Linda let the silence settle, then calmly thanked everyone for their honesty. She announced that a full restructuring of resident oversight policies would begin immediately and that an interim tenant liaison selected by neutral vote would be established until new guidelines were approved. No more informal enforcement. No more unsanctioned authority. Moving forward, governance would be professional, transparent, and protected from personal bias. There were no cheers, no applause, just a quiet ripple of breath across the room, like someone finally opening a window. That night, as Linda walked back to her apartment, she passed Karen in the hallway. Neither said a word, but Karen's expression had changed. Not just anger or defeat. It was disbelief, the kind that only sets in when someone realizes the story they've been writing no longer has the power to end the way they want. And Linda? She didn't need a dramatic finale. She had already rewritten the rules. The calm that followed the community meeting was deceptive. It wasn't a resolution, it was a reset. A moment where everyone was forced to reconsider their positions, their loyalties, their assumptions about who held power and how that power was to be used. Karen had been publicly exposed not through accusations, not even through Linda's direct action, but through the quiet, cumulative weight of truth. She hadn't been confronted. She had been outgrown. And that, for someone like her, was infinitely more humiliating. Linda knew from experience that people like Karen didn't disappear quietly. They regrouped, they rebranded, and if they felt backed into a corner, they made the corner sharp. Within a week of the meeting, the energy in the building changed again. At first it seemed subtle, residents receiving vague courtesy calls from private numbers, reminding them about the importance of cohesion. Flyers with smiley face clip art appeared on walls promoting a new group, the Wellness Unity Circle. It was voluntary, but the messaging was eerily familiar. The encouragement to report disturbances, suggestions for how to model respectful behavior, gentle reminders that some structures are better left untouched. Karen wasn't done. She was simply repackaging the same control in softer language, like a poison relabeled as vitamin water. More alarming than the return of her influence was how she started using third-party entities to regain control. One morning, a resident found a parking citation under their wiper, issued by a company that no one had ever seen on site before. That same day, a delivery driver was stopped at the entrance and told that all personal package drops now required prior approval. When questioned, the temp staff at the desk shrugged and referenced policy changes, passed along from the previous property manager, even though that individual had already been suspended. Linda's compliance team investigated and found something troubling. Karen had used a loophole in the vendor registration system to submit old copies of community forms with forged authorizations, deactivating dormant service accounts under the building's name. She hadn't just been manipulating people, she was manipulating infrastructure. But the most dangerous move came later. Linda received an email from legal marked urgent. Attached was a cease and desist notice not from Karen directly, but from a private legal group representing what they called concerned residents. The language was slick, non-accusatory, but its intent was clear. It claimed that Linda's involvement on site posed a conflict of interest, that her dual role as both a corporate executive and a temporary resident created an environment of coercion. It demanded that she recuse herself from any internal restructuring decisions. The firm was small, local, but competent, clearly funded, and behind the scenes, very likely influenced by Karen. Linda knew exactly what this was, a tactical smear attempt disguised as procedural ethics. If she responded emotionally, she could damage her credibility. If she ignored it, Karen could twist her silence into validation. Instead, Linda escalated the matter through corporate legal channels. She provided a complete record of her temporary assignment, her reporting trail, and all documentation of internal misconduct long before her name was revealed to residents. The company's general counsel responded directly to the legal group with a sharp, unwavering letter of their own, outlining the falsified records, unauthorized vendor access, and ongoing harassment claims, all under review for potential civil litigation. But damage control wasn't Karen's only strategy. She pivoted to psychological pressure, targeting those she believed were closest to Linda. One staffer from the compliance team reported being approached in a parking lot by an unknown woman, asking personal questions about his job and family. A longtime resident who had publicly supported policy changes found that her water was inexplicably shut off for 2 days, with maintenance giving vague excuses about line confusion. Even Linda, as careful as she had been, came home one evening to find her welcome mat soaked in something chemical-smelling, and a faint scrape mark under her doorknob. Nothing overt, nothing conclusive. But the timing was too precise to ignore. That night, Linda called a meeting with the executive board, not to complain, not to ask permission, but to recommend immediate structural changes. She proposed shifting all community oversight responsibilities from resident volunteer groups to professional third-party administrators with rotating contracts, eliminating the potential for long-term manipulation. She also proposed digital access logs, camera upgrades, and a community hotline run by a neutral party to allow anonymous reporting. It was bold, expensive, but she made the case with facts, patterns, and timelines. And the board, recognizing both the liability and the necessity, approved it. The implementation was fast. Within 2 weeks, new procedures were in place. The old boards were removed. Vendor credentials were purged and reissued. Residents received secure digital logins, and community correspondence was now encrypted and archived for review. For most of them, it was a relief. For Karen, it was a death sentence. Her influence was based on gaps in process and trust in oversight. Linda had closed every one. But still, Karen didn't stop. Her final act wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was desperate. A forged emergency maintenance notice appeared on Linda's door one morning. It claimed there was a gas leak in her unit and that immediate evacuation was required. The notice used official formatting and correct technical language. But Linda, trained in detail, noticed that the paper quality was wrong. And when she called the front desk, the staff had no knowledge of the issue. She called utilities directly. No reports. No leaks. It had been fake. And had been dangerous. The evacuation under false pretenses, had it been successful, could have led to unnecessary emergency calls, even harm if someone believed it and panicked. Linda handed the notice to legal, who then forwarded it to law enforcement. That was the tipping point. Karen was served with a formal restraining order. Her vendor access was permanently revoked. Her name was blacklisted from all residential administrative roles in every property owned by the company. She was not evicted, there were still legal boundaries to respect, but the message was clear. She no longer had leverage, no longer had access. Her reign had ended, not with scandal, but with structure. The residents began to settle. Slowly, cautiously. Some still looked over their shoulders. But others, the bolder ones, began to speak freely in halls again, to knock on each other's doors, to smile without calculation. Linda remained, not as a spy, not as an executive, but as the person who had stayed steady when everything else tried to push her over. She didn't celebrate. She adjusted the system and kept going. Because power, when it's real, doesn't scream. It reforms. The restraining order should have ended it. On paper, it had. Karen's authority, real or imagined, was severed from every formal channel. Her name was stripped from any administrative listing, her contact with building staff explicitly barred under penalty of legal escalation. For most people, that would have been enough, a line drawn, a wall constructed, the consequences delivered. But Linda knew better than to expect a clean break from someone who had thrived for so long in ambiguity. People like Karen didn't vanish, they simmered. They plotted in silence, convinced that structure was a phase and chaos would always find its way back through the cracks. Linda had seen it before in boardrooms, in regional offices, in communities where unchecked egos disguised as concern tore at foundations one email at a time. So when everything finally seemed to quiet down, when the building returned to its rhythm of everyday noise, garbage bins rolling down hallways, elevator chimes, the occasional barking dog, Linda didn't relax. She watched. And then came the final move. It was early morning when it happened. The building had just begun to stir, the scent of brewed coffee seeping from under doors, footsteps soft against the carpeted corridors. Linda was reviewing a lease compliance report at her kitchen table when the fire alarm blared sharp, urgent, unmistakable. Within minutes, the hallways filled with residents in bathrobes and pajamas, some annoyed, some genuinely afraid. Linda stepped out immediately, her instincts sharp. She checked the nearest alarm panel and found something off, no trigger in her zone, no smoke detected. Within 15 minutes, it was confirmed, a false alarm. No fire, no malfunction. Someone had pulled the alarm manually from the basement stairwell, an area no longer under general resident access. Security footage was reviewed. The person was masked, hooded, their build obscured by a puffy coat, gloves covering their hands. The camera caught no face. But what it did capture was timing. The alarm had been triggered moments after Linda's login badge was used to access the equipment room downstairs. A coincidence on the surface, except Linda hadn't used her badge that morning. She hadn't even left her unit. When the digital log was pulled, it showed a duplicate badge entry, her credentials, time-stamped and verified, used to gain access. Someone had cloned her ID. The act was precise, deliberate, and criminal. This wasn't just disruption. This was fabrication designed to make her look complicit in a violation of protocol. Had the company not invested in enhanced surveillance and real-time monitoring weeks prior, the incident could have easily sparked internal questions about Linda's actions. But because the new system cross-referenced biometric activity with badge use, the inconsistency was caught immediately. Linda had not been present. She had been framed. That revelation triggered an emergency escalation. The building's internal systems were locked down. All resident badges were temporarily deactivated and reissued under strict security. A forensic investigation team was called in, and law enforcement was formally brought into the matter not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. The false alarm, paired with identity cloning, crossed the threshold from internal misconduct to criminal sabotage. Linda remained calm, but this time she didn't stay invisible. She met with the residents personally, this time as the regional director, not the mysterious woman in Unit 412. She explained the incident clearly, professionally, with the tone of someone who respected the intelligence of her audience. She didn't speculate, didn't name suspects. She let the facts speak. She reaffirmed the systems now in place: new surveillance, neutral oversight, secure maintenance protocols. But more importantly, she spoke of intent. Not hers, but the intent behind control disguised as concern, manipulation packaged as order. And when she finished, she said something none of them had expected. She was stepping down. Not from her job, but from the building. Her work here was complete, and she believed the system could now sustain itself without shadow oversight. She wasn't disappearing, just returning to her position, watching from a proper distance, ensuring continued integrity without distorting it. The announcement landed with mixed emotions: relief for some, gratitude for others. And for Karen, wherever she was, it must have felt like a triumph. Except it wasn't. 2 days later, the results from the forensic report came in. The clone badge used in the false alarm had been created using a stolen access template recovered from an old service laptop one that had gone missing 2 weeks prior. The laptop had last been issued to a vendor who, upon questioning, admitted it had been borrowed briefly by someone he recognized from the building. Not staff, not management. A friendly resident who had claimed they needed to check something for a neighborhood event. He described her. Older, sharp voice, firm tone. Said her name was Catherine, though he didn't remember the last name. It was enough. The police executed a warrant. Karen's apartment was entered legally, quietly, and without drama. Inside, they recovered the missing device, hand-drawn sketches of the building's security layouts, copies of outdated vendor contracts, and 2 unused temporary badge shells. It was calculated. It was thorough. And it was criminal. Karen was not arrested on the spot that would come later, after further processing. But the evidence was irrefutable. What began as coffee on a blouse had escalated into forged credentials, weaponized fire systems, and the intentional undermining of property security. The company filed formal charges. The residents were notified of the findings. And the building, for the first time in years, exhaled. Linda didn't attend the final meeting. She didn't need to. Her work, her presence, and her patience had done what few believed was possible. She hadn't crushed Karen. She had outlasted her. And more importantly, she had restored something far rarer than order. She had restored trust. The building didn't celebrate Karen's exit. There were no parties, no toasts, no whispers of victory circulating through the mailroom or lobby. What followed was something far more profound: a collective, quiet realignment of the air, like the pressure inside the walls had shifted. It was in the way people moved through the corridors, the way elevator rides became just slightly more human, the way neighbors began nodding to each other without that old hesitation that had once curdled into silence. There was no single moment of transformation, no cinematic exhale, just an unspoken awareness that something toxic had been removed. The fear that once threatened every interaction had lifted, leaving behind something fragile but unmistakably freer. Linda spent her final 2 days in the building not packing but walking. She moved through each floor at different hours of the day, taking it all in not as a supervisor or a tenant, but as someone who had witnessed a community tremble, fight, and slowly begin to remember its own voice. She greeted residents now by name, not out of obligation but habit. Some approached her voluntarily, offered simple phrases that spoke volumes. "Thank you. I didn't know how bad it was until it stopped. You helped more than you know." But Linda never accepted praise with comfort. She knew better than most that change, when done right, shouldn't depend on the presence of a single person. It had to outlive the catalyst. It had to adapt, rebuild, and become self-sustaining. When she handed over her keys and signed the final exit form, she didn't linger. She declined a farewell dinner quietly organized by a few tenants, offered sincere appreciation, and left without ceremony. Her team remained behind, continuing to support the newly implemented systems and transition the property into its next phase, a structure rooted in neutral oversight, not personal dominance. The tenant liaison board, now elected through a clear and fair process, included a diverse mix of voices, some of whom had once feared speaking at all. Linda watched from a distance, through reports and occasional updates, as they debated real issues, collaborated without fear, and built something that no longer required her correction. She felt the work settle, finally, into the hands of the people it had always belonged to. Karen, meanwhile, was no longer a name whispered with awe or dread. She had become a cautionary footnote, referenced only in training materials and internal reviews about governance failure and unchecked informal authority. Her actions remained under legal review, and while the company pursued accountability through the appropriate channels, Linda didn't follow every detail. It wasn't personal anymore. It had never been. Karen's downfall had simply been the result of what happens when manipulation outpaces accountability for too long. And the punishment wasn't public disgrace, it was irrelevance. Karen had spent years building an identity rooted in control, and now she was left with the hollow echo of a voice no one had to obey. Linda returned to her primary office, resumed her oversight of other properties, and never spoke of Westwood in unnecessary detail. But something had changed in her too. For all her experience, all her years navigating systems and people and hidden dysfunction, this building had shown her something rare: the cost of silence. The deep, corrosive effect of letting the wrong person dictate what normal looks like. And it reminded her that leadership isn't about force, it's about presence, consistency, and knowing when to let the structure speak for itself. Several months later, she received a handwritten note forwarded through internal mail. It was from a tenant at Westwood, one who had once barely made eye contact. The message was short, almost abrupt in its sincerity. It read, "The hallway feels different now. It's not quieter, just lighter. Thought you should know." Linda kept the note in her desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Because the real work of reform isn't in breaking down what's wrong. It's in building what comes after and making sure it stands even when you're no longer there to hold it up. And so, when her company asked her to review another troubled property, this time across the country, she agreed. Not because she wanted to repeat the battle, but because she knew that sometimes the only way to restore a place is to stand quietly within it until it remembers how to breathe again.